At 04:15 on the morning of November 7th, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage stood in the conning tower of USS Trout and watched through the periscope as a Japanese destroyer passed 300 yards off his port beam. The destroyer was hunting him. Ramage could see the sonar operator on the destroyer's fantail, adjusting his equipment, searching the water with hydrophones, listening for the sound of Trout's electric motors. The destroyer's captain believed he had the advantage. He had speed, depth charges, and the certainty that the American submarine below him was running out of options. Japanese destroyer doctrine in 1943 was built on a simple calculation. American submarines carried 14 torpedoes, maybe 16 if they were lucky. Trout had been in these waters for 11 days. Japanese intelligence tracked American submarine patrols. They knew the standard loadout. They knew the patrol duration. They calculated that by day 11, most American submarines had already expended their torpedoes on merchant ships and tankers. The destroyer captain was hunting what he believed was a nearly defenseless submarine, perhaps carrying 2 or 3 torpedoes at most. What he did not know, what Japanese naval intelligence had failed to discover, what would cost the Imperial Japanese Navy dozens of destroyers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Over the next 2 years was that American fleet submarines did not carry 14 torpedoes. They carried 24, and Trout still had 9 left. Ramage watched the destroyer complete its search pattern and turn away. He waited. Patience was everything in submarine warfare. The destroyer moved to the edge of sonar range, then stopped. The Japanese captain was setting a trap. He would wait there, quiet, hoping the American submarine would surface or move, revealing its position. It was good tactics. Ramage had seen it before. But the destroyer captain had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed the submarine was nearly out of weapons. He assumed wrong. The problem began in 1938 when the United States Navy commissioned its first fleet submarines of the Tambor class. These boats were designed for long-range patrols across the Pacific, operating independently for up to 75 days without resupply. They displaced 1,475 tons surfaced, 1,968 tons submerged, length 307 feet, beam 27 feet, maximum diving depth 250 feet under test conditions, though captains routinely took them deeper in combat, powered by 4 diesel engines generating 5,400 horsepower combined, plus 4 electric motors for submerged operations. Surface speed 20 knots, submerged speed 8.75 knots, range 11,000 nautical miles, at 10 knots surfaced. Crew complement varied between 75 and 85 men, depending on configuration. The original design specifications called for 14 torpedo tubes, 6 forward, 4 aft, plus 4 in external deck mounts that could be reloaded from inside the pressure hull through specially designed hatches. Total torpedo capacity was listed as 20 torpedoes in official documentation, 10 Mark 14 steam torpedoes and 10 Mark 18 electric torpedoes. The Mark 14 weighed 3,200 pounds, carried a 660-pound TNT warhead, and had a range of 4,500 yards at 46 knots. The Mark 18 was slightly heavier at 3,250 pounds, but carried a 570-pound Torpex warhead and had a range of 4,000 yards at 29 knots. But that official capacity of 20 torpedoes did not account for what submarine crews called the hot loading modifications. Beginning in 1941, submarine tenders working at Pearl Harbor, Brisbane, and Fremantle began experimenting with additional torpedo storage. The submarines had space. Not much, but enough. The crew's mess could hold 2 additional torpedoes, secured vertically against specially reinforced bulkheads. The after battery compartment could accommodate 2 more if the crew was willing to sacrifice storage space and some berthing comfort. By mid-1942, most American fleet submarines were routinely loading 24 torpedoes, 6 in the forward tubes, 4 in the aft tubes, 4 in external mounts, 4 in forward reload racks, 2 in aft reload racks, 2 in the cruise mess, and 2 in the after battery. It was cramped. The torpedoes took up space that would otherwise be used for spare parts, extra food, or personal gear. The crew slept within arm's reach of 3,000 pounds of high explosives, but 24 torpedoes meant 24 chances to sink Japanese ships. Every submarine captain wanted maximum firepower. The Japanese never figured it out. Japanese naval intelligence knew American submarines were sinking ships at rates that seemed impossible given the assumed torpedo capacity. They had the patrol reports. They tracked American submarine movements through radio direction finding and decoded messages. They knew when submarines entered patrol areas and when they left. They counted the ships that went missing in those areas during those time periods. The numbers did not make sense. A submarine would enter the South China Sea carrying what Japanese intelligence calculated as 14 torpedoes. Over the next 3 weeks, that submarine would sink or damage 8, 9, sometimes 10 ships. Multiple torpedo hits per ship meant the submarine should have exhausted its weapons within the first 10 days. Yet the attacks continued. Ships kept sinking. Convoys kept reporting submarine attacks deep into the 3rd and 4th week of patrol periods. Japanese analysts developed theories. Perhaps American submarines were being resupplied at sea by submarine tenders operating from hidden anchorages. Perhaps the Americans had developed a way to reload torpedoes underwater from supply submarines. Perhaps American torpedoes were far more reliable than Japanese intelligence estimated, requiring fewer shots per target. All of these theories were wrong. The answer was simpler. American submarines just carried more torpedoes than the Japanese thought possible. Lieutenant Commander John Cromwell understood this intelligence gap better than most American submarine officers. Cromwell was 45 years old in 1943, older than most submarine commanders, born September 11, 1898, in Henry, Illinois. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1917. He served on surface ships during World War I, then transferred to submarines in 1924. By 1943, Cromwell had spent 19 years in submarines. He had commanded USS S-20 from 1931 to 1934. He understood submarine operations, torpedo tactics, and the critical importance of intelligence security. In September 1943, Cromwell was assigned as prospective commanding officer of USS Sculpin. The assignment meant he would observe Sculpin's current patrol, then take command when the boat returned to Pearl Harbor for refit. But Cromwell knew something most submarine officers did not. He had been briefed on Ultra, the Allied code-breaking operation that had cracked Japanese naval codes. Ultra provided precise intelligence on Japanese fleet movements, convoy routes, and defensive measures. It was the most valuable intelligence asset the United States possessed in the Pacific. If the Japanese discovered that Americans had broken their codes, they would change those codes immediately. Ultra would become worthless. Thousands of American lives would be lost because the intelligence advantage would vanish. Cromwell knew about Ultra. He knew that American submarines were using Ultra intelligence to position themselves along convoy routes. He knew that Japanese naval intelligence was struggling to understand why American submarines seemed to always be in the right place at the right time. He knew that if he were captured and interrogated, he might reveal information that would compromise Ultra. On November 19, 1943, USS Sculpin was operating north of Truk Atoll when she encountered a Japanese convoy. Captain Fred Conaway ordered an attack. Sculpin fired 4 torpedoes at a Japanese freighter. All 4 missed or malfunctioned. The convoy's escort destroyer Yamagumo immediately counterattacked. Yamagumo was a Yugumo-class destroyer, 1,980 tons, armed with depth charges and a well-trained anti-submarine crew. The destroyer dropped 18 depth charges in the first attack run. The charges exploded close enough to cause severe damage. Sculpin's diving planes jammed. The submarine could not maintain depth. She began sinking uncontrollably. Captain Conaway ordered emergency blow, forcing compressed air into the ballast tanks to create buoyancy. Sculpin shot to the surface. She emerged 300 yards from Yamagumo. The destroyer opened fire immediately with 5-inch guns. The first salvo struck Sculpin's conning tower. Captain Conaway was killed instantly. Several other officers were wounded. The submarine was taking water through shell holes. She could not dive. She could not maneuver. She was dead in the water under direct fire. The surviving senior officer ordered abandon ship. 42 men made it off the submarine before she sank. Yamagumo picked up 21 survivors. The others drowned or were killed by debris. John Cromwell was one of the survivors in the water. He had a decision to make. He could allow himself to be rescued by the Japanese and face interrogation, or he could go down with Sculpin, taking his knowledge of Ultra with him. Cromwell knew what interrogation would involve. The Japanese were systematic. They would start with routine questions: name, rank, serial number, submarine capabilities, patrol areas, crew complement. Then they would move to more specific questions. How did American submarines know where to find convoys? What intelligence methods did the Americans use? How many torpedoes did American submarines carry? That last question was critical. If Cromwell revealed that American submarines carried 24 torpedoes instead of 14, Japanese destroyer tactics would change immediately. Destroyers would remain on station longer. They would pursue submarines deeper into patrol areas. They would not assume submarines were toothless after 10 days. More aggressive destroyer tactics meant more American submarines detected, more American submarines sunk, more American submariners killed. Cromwell also knew about Ultra. Under torture, under drugs, under relentless interrogation, he might reveal information that would lead Japanese intelligence toward the code-breaking operation. Even a small clue could be catastrophic. The Japanese might realize their codes were compromised. They might change their encryption methods. The intelligence advantage would disappear. Cromwell chose to drown. He refused rescue. He let himself sink with Sculpin. He was 45 years old. He had a wife and children waiting for him in the United States. He chose death to protect his shipmates and preserve the intelligence advantage that was helping America win the war. The Navy awarded him the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation read, in part, how he deliberately sacrificed his life rather than risk capture and subsequent danger to his country. The Japanese never learned what Cromwell knew. They never discovered that American submarines carried 24 torpedoes. They never broke the code-breaking operation. American submarines continued sinking Japanese ships at devastating rates, and Japanese destroyer captains continued operating under false assumptions about American torpedo capacity. Those false assumptions proved fatal throughout 1944 and 1945. Japanese destroyer doctrine was built around pursuit and attrition. When a destroyer detected an American submarine, the standard tactic was to pursue aggressively for the first 8 to 10 days of the submarine's patrol. During that period, the destroyer captain assumed the submarine still had torpedoes and was dangerous. After day 10, the destroyer captain would calculate that the submarine had probably expended most of its weapons on merchant targets. The pursuit would become less aggressive. The destroyer might break off entirely to escort other convoys. This tactical doctrine made sense if American submarines carried 14 torpedoes. A submarine firing at merchant ships would expend 2 or 3 torpedoes per target, accounting for malfunctions and misses. 4 or 5 targets meant 12 to 15 torpedoes expended. By day 10 or 11, the submarine would be nearly defenseless, carrying perhaps 1 or 2 torpedoes for emergency use or for attacks on particularly valuable targets. But American submarines were not carrying 14 torpedoes. They were carrying 24, and they were not running out of weapons on day 10. They were still fully capable of sinking destroyers on day 15, day 20, day 25. Japanese destroyer captains discovered this the hard way. USS Harder proved it in June 1944. Commander Samuel Dealey commanded Harder, a Gato-class fleet submarine commissioned in December 1942. Dealey was 33 years old, from Dallas, Texas. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1930. He had commanded Harder through 4 war patrols by June 1944, sinking 15 Japanese ships. He was aggressive, skilled, and absolutely fearless. His crew called him Destroyer Killer Dealey because of his preference for attacking Japanese warships instead of merchant vessels. On June 6, 1944, Harder was operating in Sibitu Passage between Borneo and the Philippines. Japanese destroyer Minazuki detected Harder on sonar and began pursuit. The destroyer captain followed standard doctrine. He assumed Harder had been on patrol for at least a week and had probably expended half her torpedoes on merchant shipping. The pursuit was aggressive, but not desperate. The destroyer maintained sonar contact, but did not press too close. The captain was confident the submarine would eventually surface to recharge batteries, at which point Minazuki would close in for the kill. Dealey had other plans. Harder was carrying 24 torpedoes and had expended only 6 on her current patrol. She had 18 left. 18 torpedoes meant Dealey could afford to use 4 on a single destroyer. Most submarine captains avoided attacking destroyers because destroyers were difficult targets. They were fast, maneuverable, and designed specifically to kill submarines. Firing at a destroyer meant accepting lower hit probabilities and higher risk, but Dealey specialized in destroyer attacks. He understood destroyer tactics. Japanese destroyers approaching a suspected submarine contact would increase speed and charge straight in for a depth charge attack. That created a predictable path. If a submarine captain could estimate the destroyer's course and speed accurately, he could position ahead of the destroyer's attack run and fire torpedoes down the throat directly at the oncoming warship. It was called a down-the-throat shot. It was extremely dangerous. If the torpedoes missed, the destroyer would be directly above the submarine within seconds, dropping depth charges at point-blank range. But if the torpedoes hit, the destroyer would sink before it could attack. Dealey waited for Minazuki to commit to an attack run. The destroyer accelerated to 28 knots and charged straight toward Harder's last known position. Dealey tracked the destroyer through the periscope. He calculated course, speed, and range. At 1,800 yards, he fired 4 torpedoes down the throat. Minazuki had 15 seconds to react. Not enough time. The first torpedo struck the destroyer's bow. The explosion ripped through the forward magazine, where depth charges were stored. The secondary explosion destroyed the entire forward section of the ship. Minazuki broke in half and sank in 90 seconds. 180 men died. 2 days later, on June 8th, Harder encountered destroyer Hyanami. Same situation. The destroyer detected Harder on sonar and began pursuit. The destroyer captain assumed the submarine was low on torpedoes after more than a week on patrol. The pursuit was measured, not aggressive. Dealey executed another down-the-throat attack. 4 torpedoes. Hyanami sank in under 2 minutes. Another 180 men dead. On June 9th, Harder was operating near Tawi when she encountered 3 destroyers simultaneously: Tanikaze, Urakaze, and Shigure. The 3 destroyers were part of a hunter-killer group specifically organized to find and destroy American submarines. They had been searching for Harder for 2 days. They knew an American submarine was operating in the area. They intended to find it and sink it. The 3 destroyers spread out in a line formation and began a coordinated sonar search. Tanikaze detected Harder at 2,200 yards. All 3 destroyers converged on the contact. Standard Japanese anti-submarine doctrine called for 1 destroyer to maintain sonar contact while the other 2 attacked from different angles, preventing the submarine from escaping. Dealey watched all 3 destroyers through the periscope. He knew he was trapped. 3 destroyers attacking simultaneously meant he could not evade. He had 2 options: surface and fight with the deck gun, which would be suicide against 3 destroyers, or attack one of them and hope the other 2 would break off to rescue survivors. Dealey chose to attack. He positioned Harder directly in the path of Tanikaze and waited for the destroyer to commit to its attack run. At 1,500 yards, he fired 3 torpedoes down the throat. The Japanese captain saw the torpedo wakes and tried to turn. Too late. 2 torpedoes struck Tanikaze amidships. The destroyer exploded and sank within 60 seconds. Dealey ordered emergency deep. Harder dove to 350 feet, well beyond her test depth of 300 feet. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The hull groaned under the pressure. Urakazi and Shigura dropped 30 depth charges between them. None were close enough to cause serious damage. The 2 surviving destroyers continued the pursuit for 3 hours, then broke off. They had lost 1 destroyer. Their orders were to escort the fleet, not hunt submarines indefinitely. They returned to Tawi-Tawi. Harder had sunk 3 destroyers in 4 days. All 3 attacks followed the same pattern. Japanese destroyer captains assumed the submarine was low on torpedoes. They pursued, but not aggressively. They committed to attack runs without considering that the submarine might still have sufficient torpedoes to fight back effectively. All 3 captains paid for that miscalculation with their lives and their ships. Dealey's patrol continued. On June 10th, Harder rendezvoused with USS Hake and USS Hado near Borneo. The 3 submarines formed a wolf pack under Dealey's tactical command. Their mission was to intercept Japanese fleet units moving from Tawi-Tawi toward the Philippine Sea. Admiral Somu Toyoda had ordered the Japanese fleet to sortie for a decisive battle against American carrier forces. The resulting engagement would be called the Battle of the Philippine Sea. But before the Japanese fleet could engage the American carriers, it had to pass through waters patrolled by Dealey's Wolfpack. On the morning of June 11th, the 3 submarines detected multiple contacts, heavy units, battleships, cruisers, and at least 8 destroyers as escorts. It was the Japanese fleet sortie. Dealey positioned his submarines for attack, but before the submarines could fire at the capital ships, 2 destroyers detached from the formation and charged toward the submarine positions, Asashio and Michishio. Both destroyers were hunting contacts their sonar had detected. Both captains assumed they were pursuing submarines that had been on patrol for at least 10 days and were probably low on torpedoes. Both captains expected the submarines to evade rather than fight. Dealey attacked Asashio. Down the throat shot, 4 torpedoes, 3 hits. Asashio sank in under 3 minutes. Michishio saw what happened and immediately turned away, breaking off the attack. The destroyer captain reported to the fleet commander that the Americans had multiple submarines operating in a coordinated wolf pack, that at least 1 submarine was still carrying full torpedo capacity despite being on extended patrol, and that aggressive pursuit was inadvisable. The Japanese fleet commander adjusted his course away from the submarine contact area. The sortie was delayed by 6 hours, while the fleet detoured around the suspected submarine positions. That 6-hour delay was critical. By the time the Japanese fleet reached the Philippine Sea, American carrier aircraft had already launched. The resulting battle was a catastrophic defeat for Japan. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese lost 3 carriers and over 400 aircraft. American losses were minimal. Harder's aggressive attacks and the Japanese fleet's decision to detour contributed to the timing that made the American victory possible. Dealey returned to Fremantle on June 26th after 28 days on patrol. He had sunk 5 destroyers and forced the Japanese fleet to adjust its course. The Navy awarded him his 4th Navy Cross. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarines Pacific, sent a message to all submarines. Harder has proven that aggressive submarine tactics can sink destroyers. All submarines are encouraged to engage enemy destroyers when tactical situations permit. But Harder's success came with a price. Samuel Dealey took Harder on her 6th patrol in August 1944. The patrol area was Dassault Bay on the west coast of Luzon. On August 24th, Harder was operating in shallow water when she encountered a Japanese convoy heavily escorted by destroyers and patrol boats. Dealey attacked the convoy and sank 2 freighters. The escorts counterattacked, multiple destroyers, multiple patrol boats, all dropping depth charges in coordinated patterns. Harder was trapped in shallow water. She could not dive deep. She could not escape. The depth charges came closer with each attack run. Harder was hit multiple times. The pressure hull ruptured. The submarine flooded and sank with all 79 crew members. Samuel Dealey was 34 years old when he died. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously for his actions during the 5th patrol in June. The pattern repeated throughout 1944. Japanese destroyer captains assumed American submarines carried 14 torpedoes. They calculated that submarines on extended patrols were probably low on weapons. They pursued, but not aggressively. They broke off attacks that should have been pressed harder. American submarines exploited that miscalculation. They carried 24 torpedoes. They remained dangerous throughout their entire patrol period. They sank destroyers on day 15, day 20, day 25 of patrols the Japanese intelligence calculated should have left them defenseless. USS Tang demonstrated this in October 1944. Commander Richard O'Kane took Tang into the Taiwan Strait with 24 torpedoes. Over 5 days, Tang sank multiple Japanese ships. On October 23rd and 24th, Tang encountered heavily escorted convoys. Japanese destroyer captains calculated that Tang had been on patrol for approximately 3 weeks and should be nearly out of torpedoes. The escorts were aggressive initially, but when Tang evaded the first depth charge attacks, several destroyers broke off to maintain position with the convoy rather than pursue the submarine. They assumed Tang was conserving her last few torpedoes for high-value targets and would not waste them on destroyers. O'Kane attacked the convoys directly, firing repeatedly, sinking multiple ships. The Japanese destroyer captains were stunned. How was this submarine still firing? How many torpedoes did it carry? The attacks continued until Tang fired her 24th torpedo. That final torpedo malfunctioned and ran in a circle, striking Tang and sinking her. But the point was made. Tang had fired 24 torpedoes over 5 days, not 14. 24. Japanese naval intelligence never adjusted their estimates. Post-war analysis of Japanese documents shows that throughout 1944 and into 1945, Japanese anti-submarine doctrine continued to assume American submarines carried 14 to 16 torpedoes. Training manuals for destroyer captains continued to recommend reduced pursuit aggression after submarines had been on patrol for 10 or more days. The intelligence failure was comprehensive and permanent. Why did Japanese intelligence fail to discover the actual torpedo capacity? Several factors contributed. First, very few American submarines were captured intact. When submarines were sunk, they usually went down in deep water with their entire crews. There were no survivors to interrogate, no wrecks to examine, no torpedo rooms to inspect. The few American submariners who were captured alive generally refused to provide accurate information about submarine capabilities. Second, Japanese intelligence focused heavily on technical specifications from pre-war sources. They had access to Jane's fighting ships and other naval reference publications that listed American submarine specifications based on 1938 design data. Those references listed 20 torpedoes as maximum capacity. Japanese analysts accepted that figure and never questioned it. Third, the Japanese did not systematically analyze the pattern of American submarine attacks. Individual convoy commanders reported submarine attacks, but there was no centralized analysis tracking total torpedoes expended per submarine per patrol. If such analysis had been conducted, the discrepancy would have been obvious. But Japanese naval intelligence was fragmented. Different commands analyzed different data sets. No one put together the complete picture. Fourth, captured documents from American submarines were rare and incomplete. When Japanese forces recovered debris from sunken submarines, they usually found personal effects, technical manuals and patrol reports, but rarely found complete records of torpedo inventory. The documents that were recovered often showed only the torpedoes expended, not the total carried. Fifth, American submarine crews maintained operational security. Even when communicating by radio with Pearl Harbor or other American bases, submarines used code phrases for torpedo status. A submarine reporting birds remaining did not specify exact numbers. Japanese code breakers could intercept these messages but could not determine actual torpedo counts from the coded language. The result was a systematic intelligence failure that cost Japan dozens of destroyers and hundreds of merchant ships. Japanese destroyer captains operated throughout 1944 and 1945 under false assumptions about American submarine capabilities. They pursued submarines aggressively early in patrol periods, but reduced pressure after 10 days. They broke off engagements prematurely. They failed to press attacks that might have resulted in American submarine losses. American submarines exploited this weakness ruthlessly. Captains learned that Japanese destroyers would back off after extended pursuits. They used that knowledge to remain in patrol areas longer, sink more ships, and survive encounters that should have been fatal. The torpedo capacity advantage was not about technology. American torpedoes were not substantially better than Japanese torpedoes. The Mark 14 had serious reliability problems throughout 1942 and 1943. The Mark 18 was slower and had shorter range than Japanese torpedoes. The advantage was purely numerical. American submarines carried 10 more torpedoes than Japanese intelligence estimated. That meant 10 more chances to sink ships, 10 more opportunities to attack, 10 more reasons for Japanese destroyer captains to remain cautious even when they believed they were pursuing a nearly defenseless submarine. The psychological impact was significant. Japanese destroyer captains who survived encounters with American submarines filed reports describing submarines that seemed to have unlimited torpedoes. They described pursuing a submarine for 15 days only to have it turn and attack with multiple torpedoes. They described submarines that fired, evaded, and fired again repeatedly throughout extended patrol periods. These reports created uncertainty among Japanese destroyer crews. If submarines could carry that many torpedoes, how could any destroyer safely approach? If submarines remained dangerous throughout their entire patrol period, when was pursuit safe? The uncertainty translated to hesitation, and hesitation in anti-submarine warfare meant lost opportunities to sink submarines. By late 1944, Japanese destroyer losses had become unsustainable. The Imperial Japanese Navy had commissioned approximately 170 destroyers between 1937 and 1945. By October 1944, more than 120 had been sunk or damaged beyond repair. Submarine attacks accounted for approximately 38 destroyers sunk. Many of those losses involved Japanese destroyers pursuing American submarines under the false assumption that the submarines were low on torpedoes. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 illustrated the cumulative impact. American submarines operating around the Philippines encountered multiple Japanese fleet units moving toward the invasion area. USS Data and USS Dace intercepted a cruiser force in Palawan Passage on October 23rd. Both submarines were on extended patrols. Japanese destroyer escorts calculated that both submarines should be low on torpedoes after more than 2 weeks at sea. The escorts pursued aggressively initially, but when both submarines evaded the first depth charge attacks, 2 of the 4 destroyers broke off to maintain position with the cruisers. Data and Dace both attacked. Data sank heavy cruisers, Atago and Takao. Dace sank heavy cruiser Maya. 3 heavy cruisers destroyed in one attack. The Japanese force commander was killed when Atago sank. The loss disrupted Japanese command coordination during the subsequent battle. The 2 destroyers that had broken off pursuit could have prevented those attacks if they had pressed harder, but they assumed the submarines were nearly out of torpedoes and conserved their depth charges for what they believed would be more dangerous threats later. USS Data ran aground while evading the remaining destroyers. The submarine was abandoned and destroyed to prevent capture. But post-war analysis revealed Data had fired only 8 of her 24 torpedoes when she attacked the cruiser force. She still had 16 torpedoes remaining. If the Japanese destroyer captains had known that, they would not have broken off pursuit. They would have pressed the attack harder. Data might have been sunk before she could fire at the cruisers. The intelligence failure extended to submarine rescue operations. When American submarines were damaged or forced to surface, Japanese destroyer captains often assumed the submarine was out of torpedoes and approached carelessly for rescue operations or to capture survivors. This assumption led to additional Japanese destroyer losses when submarines that appeared helpless suddenly fired remaining torpedoes at point-blank range. USS Harder's engagement with destroyer Tanikaze on June 9th demonstrated this. After sinking Tanikaze, Harder was detected by destroyers Urikaze and Shigura. Both destroyers assumed Harder had expended all torpedoes, sinking Tanikaze, and was now defenseless. They closed to within 1,000 yards to conduct a sonar search before depth charging. Harder still had 15 torpedoes. Dealey considered attacking both destroyers, but decided against it because the tactical situation was unfavorable. If the Japanese captains had known Harder still had 15 torpedoes, they would not have closed to 1,000 yards. They would have maintained at least 3,000 yards distance and conducted depth charge attacks from safer range. The pattern continued into 1945. By early 1945, Japanese fuel shortages limited destroyer operations. Remaining destroyers were concentrated around the home islands and major convoy routes. American submarines operating in these areas encountered more aggressive opposition, but the underlying Japanese assumptions about American torpedo capacity remained unchanged. USS Archerfish sank Japanese carrier Shinano on November 29, 1944, using only 6 torpedoes. Shinano was the largest aircraft carrier ever built at that time, displacing 72,000 tons fully loaded. She was being transferred from Yokosuka Naval Arsenal to Kure Naval Base for final fitting out. Her escort consisted of 3 destroyers. The destroyer captains knew Archerfish had been operating in the area for over 2 weeks. They calculated she was probably low on torpedoes. When Archerfish attacked, the destroyers pursued, but not aggressively. They assumed the submarine had used most of her torpedoes on previous targets and would not have enough remaining to pose a serious threat to 3 destroyers. Archerfish fired 6 torpedoes at Shinano. 4 hit. The carrier was not fully watertight because fitting out was incomplete. She flooded progressively and sank 7 hours after the attack. The destroyers attempted to depth charge Archerfish but did not press the attack hard enough to force the submarine away from the area. Commander Joseph Enright, Archerfish's captain, later reported that he still had 18 torpedoes remaining after sinking Shinano. He could have attacked any of the 3 destroyers if they had approached within range. They never did, because they assumed he was out of torpedoes. The intelligence failure about American submarine torpedo capacity represents one of the most consequential oversights in naval warfare history. It was not a complex technological secret. It was a simple, numerical fact. American submarines carried 24 torpedoes instead of 14. Japanese intelligence could have discovered this through systematic analysis of submarine attack patterns, through interrogation of captured submariners, through examination of sunken submarines, or through basic reconnaissance of American submarine facilities. They never did. The assumption that American submarines carried 14 torpedoes persisted from 1941 through August 1945. It influenced Japanese destroyer tactics throughout the Pacific War. It led directly to the loss of dozens of destroyers. It contributed to the loss of hundreds of merchant ships that might have been protected if destroyer escorts had pursued American submarines more aggressively. The psychological impact on Japanese destroyer crews was severe. By late 1944, Japanese destroyer captains were increasingly reluctant to engage American submarines because submarines kept firing torpedoes long after they should have been exhausted. The uncertainty created hesitation, and hesitation in naval warfare was fatal. American submarines exploited this weakness. Until the end of the war, they carried 24 torpedoes on every patrol. They fired at targets throughout their entire patrol period. They sank ships on day 1 and on day 30 with equal effectiveness. They attacked destroyers when tactical situations permitted. They maintained offensive capability far longer than Japanese doctrine anticipated. The result was devastating. American submarines sank 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5,300,000 tons. They sank 214 Japanese warships, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 38 destroyers. Submarine warfare accounted for 55% of all Japanese shipping losses during the war. The torpedo capacity advantage was not the only factor contributing to American submarine success. American submarines had better radar, better sonar, better fire control computers, better training, and better leadership. But the 24 torpedo capacity gave American submarines staying power that Japanese defenders never anticipated. Submarines could conduct extended patrols, engage multiple targets, fight through escort screens, and still have torpedoes remaining for high-value targets. Japanese destroyer captains never adapted their tactics to account for this reality because Japanese intelligence never corrected the false estimate of American submarine torpedo capacity. The failure illustrates how small intelligence oversights can have strategic consequences. A simple misunderstanding about how many torpedoes fit inside a submarine pressure hull led to tactical decisions that cost Japan hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors. If Japanese intelligence had discovered in 1942 that American submarines carried 24 torpedoes instead of 14, Japanese destroyer tactics would have changed. Pursuits would have been more aggressive. Attacks would have been pressed harder. More American submarines would have been sunk. Fewer Japanese ships would have been lost. But that discovery never happened. The intelligence failure persisted until the end of the war. Japanese destroyer captains operated under false assumptions until August 1945. They broke off pursuits prematurely. They conserved depth charges unnecessarily. They failed to press attacks that might have destroyed American submarines. American submarines exploited that failure ruthlessly. They carried 24 torpedoes and used every single one to devastating effect. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.